In this video, I'm going to tell you about why I am tired of big in my miniatures. It's probably a trend that you've seen if you've been paying attention to tabletop wargaming, for some time now. There's been a trend, obviously, to get into more skirmish games, and I've talked about it a bunch here on the channel, but I'm noticing as that's going on, it's a lot of people like to talk about it, but it is not the only direction that tabletop wargaming is going in. It is certainly a direction, and I appreciate it because it's the type of game I like. I think it's also something that a lot of people who are getting into the hobby can kind of latch onto because you're building a smaller force as opposed to building, some large army or something along those lines. But I've noticed that also beyond just here's the skirmish thing, and that's the new thing here in wargaming, and it is to some degree, there's also this other direction, and I'm going to talk about that. Lately, the biggest dogs out there, which are Games Workshop, they're the biggest in the industry, they have been producing a number of models that it's been happening again and again. Like, they've done big models in the past. If you go all the way back into even Warhammer Fantasy, I'm pretty sure the Glotkin was a model, that big Nurgle guy with the dudes riding on top of him. I'm pretty sure that model was originally back on a rectangular base. I'm pretty sure. So it's been around for a while. And there have been other large models that have been around for a while. But since the launch of Age of Sigmar, and since the launch of now 8th edition and now 9th edition of 40K, we're starting to see not so many big armies. Obviously, there are still plenty of people out there who are playing, 2,000 points and 2,500 points or even 3,000 points, getting into stuff like, Apocalypse. And that's fine. That's another type of big. But what I'm talking about is the big models. And I'm talking about the new giants that they came out with, those really, really, really big dogs. And, the robots like your Imperial Knights, the many different types, the ones with the weird shoulders and the original ones. And now we're starting to see these other kind of big models. We just saw the big orc riding the big vulture. And and now the dragons that we've seen as well. And it's just, there's a lot of different big models that keep coming out from Games Workshop and some other companies as well. There's a game that I'm kind of interested in called The Other Side from Weird, the company that makes Malifaux. And they've got some pretty big models in that line as well, including a big fishman, which I'll talk a little bit about in a sec. But the thing that's sort of kind of, it's not to my liking, and this is, again, my opinion. I'm not a big fan of the big models because I want to paint miniatures. And the big models, at least to me, in many situations, are a bit daunting, and they may be to you as well. Sometimes a big model makes a lot of sense. Games Workshop just recently showed off these new dragons that are going to be coming for Age of Sigmar. And it makes sense that dragons are big and massive, and I get that. And they're very cool sculpts, and that's cool and interesting and whatever. But there have been some other big models that, in my opinion, don't need to be like that they've done also not so recently, or not recently, I guess. Before the pandemic. It's all a blur. But the Ossiarch Bone Reapers have got this sort of like little weird kind of, you're pushing around like a whole bunch, it's almost like a diorama. And so do the Sisters of Battle. There's the St. Catherine or something like that. And it's not even just like a big model, like, like I mentioned, like a Glotkin or the dragons and that kind of stuff. It's a whole bunch of stuff and multiple people and all kinds of things going on, and you're pushing that around on the table. I find that I have issues with big models like that. And it's not moral issues. I'm not saying that they shouldn't do it, because there are some folks out there who might like that stuff. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec too. The issue I find is I don't generally want to paint something that large, because especially with those more kind of diorama style pieces, there's a lot of bits there that I have to get at, and I either have to build them in multi-stage kind of sub-assemblies and all that kind of stuff, and then glue them all together at the end, or glue them all together at once, prime them all at once, and then probably never finish the model because I'm never going to get into paint into all the weird areas, and I should have done it in the sub-assembly in the first place. So there's that. Big models to me are daunting because there's just so much more there to paint. And there can be, in many situations, so much more detail. Sometimes just a big model is just like, well, you just spray a bunch of it of color and then you put it, maybe a big spray wash on it with your airbrush and you touch up the teeth and you do some stuff with the eyes and the wings or whatever. And then boom, there you go. You got yourself a dragon or whatever. But we all know Games Workshop, they keep putting more and more detail into the models. And just because it's a big honkin' model doesn't mean that it has less detail in most situations. And that can be very daunting to a person like me, and very possibly like you, who is looking at that model and thinking, I want that for my army. But geez, I don't know. In my opinion, the worst thing that can happen is that you get real excited about this big honkin' model because it's got really super cool stats or it's going to be really cool in your army or whatever. And then you buy it and then just are too afraid to put it together even, because you might put it together not in the right sequence. You might be like, well, I should probably keep this part off because it's going to be easier to paint. Oh, I already glued this part on and now I'm kind of screwed here. There's a lot of those things that can just kind of push you back. And now you bought this model. You spent $150, $200 in some situations for these massive models. And now you have to figure out, how am I going to put it together? How am I going to paint it? And a bunch of other things too, like how am I going to get it around? How am I going to travel with it from here to my friend's house or here to a tournament or here to the shop to play a game? I mean, some of these models are so big that you almost kind of need a case for just that model. Maybe not a huge case, but at the very least, most of them, if you do that thing with the different foam trays, you need your own foam tray sometimes just for that one big model. And even then, it still might not be, it'd still be a little bit worse for wear, I think, when you might get to where you're going, depending on how far you're traveling. Really huge models just have a lot more mass to them, and that means that they're more likely to break when dropped and stuff like that. If I drop a little guy like this, even this guy, who's not that small, but still, he's not a big model. If I drop him on carpet, he's fine. If I drop him on hardwood, it's a different story. You drop a big model like an Imperial Knight or a Star Drake or things like that, stuff's going to come off. So, you have to be very careful with these things. There's a lot to them. And also, again, on a bigger model, everything is magnified. And if you put a model together wrong, it can really, really look weird. And you can have gaps that can be just literally too big to fill. I mentioned this from the other side, this Fishman guy who is a super cool looking model, and I really like him. And the thing that's cool about the other side is those models, even though they're big, they're already put together. So I'm already like, ahead on buying that model. Except mine's got some really, 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 really big gaps because it's a much larger model, and so therefore the gaps, I guess, are also magnified. And so that's kind of a bummer. And it's not just big models that I'm not particularly into either. I'm also, and I've mentioned this a bunch of times, not into big armies. And those two things can be kind of, they can put the same sort of, I don't want to say fear, but concern into you as a hobbyist when you're looking at, here's a big, huge, massive model that you have to build and paint and store and all that kind of stuff and, transport. It's just as difficult to do a whole bunch of little tiny people, but have a big, big, big army of them. It's the same type of storage and transport issues, and though it may be easier to paint each individual, there's just so much more to paint, And so I guess the real question here that you may be asking is, hey, that's all great, Uncle Adam, that you are, you don't like big, but why should we care? Well, here's the reason that you should care. It's because this may be something that's limiting you in your hobby. You may be, hopping in on the marketing and seeing these big new models and going, wow, that's awesome. And then you go to the store and you wait for launch day, and then the door opens and you get to go in and you get to be the first person to buy the giant, whatever, honking $200 model. And then you might just set it down in the basement or in your hobby room next to the two other ones that you've already bought and not necessarily built. And then you look at them and go, I really should start that today. And then you don't. Just because you see the marketing and you see all the information about the big, models, and very possibly also the games that have the big armies, that may not be for you, even though the marketing keeps telling you that it is. You may, and your friends may have differing ideas. They may love painting a whole bunch of little kind of, Tyranids or Skaven or whatever kind of giant, or Soviets, if you play something like a World War II game. They very frequently are also a big horde army with a lot of models. And or they may love to paint the giant, centerpiece type models in and put them into their armies. And you see them on all the time online and on the Reddit and whatever, all the different websites, Twitter. But that doesn't mean that necessarily that's actually something that everybody has to do. It may not be for you. It's not for me, and I'm explaining to you why. And some of these things may have rung true, and you may look at them and go, you know what? I don't think that I want to have a big honkin' giant whatever, to keep on a shelf and then put into a special case and then go to my friend's house and play. And, that's only if I make it through the entire kind of ordeal of building and painting it. There are plenty of people out there who love that kind of stuff. And those people aren't wrong, and that's who those models are great for. But it not necessarily is great for everybody. Just because a company comes out with models doesn't mean that they are necessarily for you, I guess. That sounds obvious, but to a lot of people, they, pull the trigger because in many situations, buying the models is the easy part. Building them, transporting them, storing them, painting them, all that other stuff can be real difficult. And the bigger the model, the bigger the issues. So it may behoove you to kind of sit down and have a think about whether or not you like building big models. If you've done it in the past, you've built and painted a couple of big models and you really enjoyed the process, well, then it's obvious. It's definitely something for you. And, more of those are probably coming, I'm sure. It seems to be the trend right now. But if you have got maybe one or two sort of big models that are kind of halfway through process and aren't quite finished and you're not really sure and everything like that, maybe it's time to, fish or cut bait, I think is the term that they use, and decide, look, maybe I should try to sell these to a friend or something like that, and focus more on either games that use smaller models or smaller amounts of models, or potentially work on, maybe I have a big army game because I love the spectacle of a big army, but I just don't want any big models in it anymore. So I'll have more small models versus big models. It's important for you to understand how you like to do your hobby. And just because a company says this is the new hotness doesn't mean you have to pay attention to it, because you may have different ideas. So pay attention to how you've, done this in the past. And if you are brand new, think about looking at some of these big models, maybe asking some of your friends what kind of pitfalls they go through, and figure out if it's really time for you to invest in a giant honkin' model like that, or maybe you want to start with something smaller.